When Thomas Caldwell's plow struck an unexpected metal hatch buried beneath his Pennsylvania wheat field, he never imagined that heavily armed government agents would surround his farmhouse before dawn the next morning, or that his accidental discovery would unearth a forgotten World War II bunker containing encrypted Nazi documents so sensitive that even his 2 decades in Army intelligence hadn't prepared him for the international crisis they would trigger. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if you're fascinated by hidden historical discoveries like this one, make sure you're subscribed. The April sun beat down on Thomas Caldwell's weathered neck as he guided his tractor across the freshly thawed north field of Riverbed Farm. At 62, the deep creases around his eyes told the story of 2 decades in Army intelligence, followed by 15 years working his family's struggling wheat farm, a life marked by duty, patience, and a careful attention to detail that most people overlooked. "Another hour should finish this section," he muttered to himself, adjusting the plow depth as he navigated around a particularly rocky patch. The old John Deere tractor, meticulously maintained despite its 30 years of service, responded with the reliable rumble that had become the soundtrack to Thomas's second career as a farmer in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. The small weather radio clipped to the tractor's frame delivered the day's forecast, expecting continued clear skies with temperatures reaching the mid-70s. Perfect planting conditions expected to continue through the weekend. The drought warning for Somerset County has been lifted following last week's substantial rainfall. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. After 3 years of challenging weather patterns that had devastated crops across the region, this spring was showing promise. Unlike some neighboring farms that had been sold to agricultural conglomerates unable to weather the financial storms, Riverbed Farm had survived, barely, thanks to Thomas's military pension and the stubborn resilience that defined the Caldwell family's century-long tenure on this land. The 80-acre Riverbed Farm sat nestled between 2 gentle ridgelines in Somerset County, with the nearest neighbor almost 2 miles down the winding country road. The white 2-story farmhouse, built by Thomas's grandfather in 1947, stood in stark contrast to the modern solar array and satellite internet dish Thomas had installed to maintain connectivity despite the property's remote location. Inside his kitchen, the oak table was covered with seed catalogues and weather forecasts. A single photograph stood on the windowsill. Thomas, in desert camouflage, standing beside 4 other soldiers in front of a nondescript government building in Kabul. The frame contained the only visible evidence of his extensive career in military intelligence operations that he never discussed, even with his son, who now lived in Pittsburgh with his own family. The farm had belonged to the Caldwells since 1919. When Thomas's great-grandfather returned from World War I and purchased the land with his service pay. For generations, it had provided a modest but dignified living, but climate change and agricultural consolidation had transformed farming from a reliable livelihood into a precarious gamble. Small family operations like Riverbed Farm were becoming increasingly rare in a landscape dominated by corporate agriculture and its economy of scale. Thomas had returned to the farm after his wife's death from cancer 7 years earlier, exchanging the analytical complexities of intelligence work for the more tangible challenges of coaxing life from soil. The transition from government analyst to struggling farmer hadn't been easy. His specialized training had prepared him for identifying patterns in seemingly random data points, but offered little guidance for battling unpredictable weather and unstable commodity prices. As the tractor approached the northern section of the field, an area that had remained uncultivated for several years due to poor drainage, Thomas noticed unusual contours in the soil that spring runoff had partially exposed. His analytical mind still sharp despite the years away from intelligence. Work registered the subtle pattern of unnaturally straight lines beneath the surface. "That's odd," he murmured, slowing the tractor to study the ground more carefully. Something about the rectangular depression struck him as deliberately engineered, rather than naturally occurring. The plow blade struck metal with a jarring clang that reverberated through the tractor's frame. Thomas immediately cut the engine and climbed down, his knees protesting after hours in the cab. Kneeling in the freshly turned soil, he began clearing away dirt with his hands, revealing what appeared to be a metal hatch partially exposed by the plow's path. "What the hell?" he whispered, his heart rate quickening as he uncovered more of the object. The metal was weathered but surprisingly intact, a flat panel approximately 4 feet square with what appeared to be a sophisticated locking mechanism, unlike anything Thomas had seen in standard agricultural infrastructure. More concerning was the symbol partially visible on its surface, an eagle clutching what might be a swastika, though decades of corrosion made it difficult to discern with certainty. Years of intelligence training kicked in as Thomas methodically photographed the discovery with his phone before continuing to clear soil from around the panel. The hatch appeared to be part of a larger underground structure extending beneath his field, something substantial and deliberately concealed. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. Somerset County had no significant military installations that he was aware of, and certainly nothing dating back to World War II with German iconography. The region had been home to coal mining operations, but this construction was entirely different from typical mine infrastructure. As dusk approached, Thomas had exposed enough of the hatch to confirm his suspicions. This was a deliberately engineered entrance to an underground facility constructed with materials and techniques consistent with military bunker design. The craftsmanship suggested European rather than American engineering, and details of the locking mechanism matched descriptions he'd encountered during his intelligence career of German secure facilities from the 1940s. But how could a Nazi bunker possibly exist on American soil, undetected for nearly 80 years and coincidentally located on his family's farm? Thomas sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow as he considered the implications. His military intelligence background urged caution. Unexpected discoveries of this nature often carried unforeseen complications. Yet his farmer's practicality wondered if the structure might somehow impact his field's drainage problems or pose environmental hazards to his crops. The sun was setting as Thomas made his decision. This discovery required proper documentation before any further investigation. He took additional photographs from multiple angles, careful to include reference objects for scale, then reluctantly replaced some of the soil over the hatch. He marked the location with a bright orange survey flag and recorded the GPS coordinates on his phone. As darkness fell across Riverbed Farm, Thomas drove the tractor back to the barn with uncharacteristic haste. The discovery had triggered instincts dormant since his intelligence days, a heightened awareness that something significant lay beneath the mundane surface of his quiet farming life. What Thomas couldn't know as he secured his equipment for the night was that his photographs had already begun an unstoppable chain of events. The automatic cloud backup feature on his phone had synchronized the images to servers where sophisticated pattern recognition algorithms had identified the partially visible German insignia, triggering silent alerts in government systems designed to monitor precisely such anomalous discoveries. Thomas awoke at 4:17 a.m. to the distinctive crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. Living alone on an isolated farm had honed his senses to any unusual sounds, particularly before dawn. He moved to the window with the silent efficiency that had once characterized his military operations, careful to remain hidden behind the curtain as he surveyed his property. 3 black SUVs with government plates had formed a semicircle in front of his farmhouse, their headlights extinguished. 6 figures in tactical gear were already establishing a perimeter around his home, moving with the coordinated precision that indicated professional training. 2 more individuals in dark suits stood beside the lead vehicle, consulting what appeared to be satellite imagery of his property. "Well, that didn't take long," Thomas muttered, surprised but not shocked by the rapid response. His intelligence background had taught him how certain discoveries triggered established protocols, regardless of their apparent insignificance. Rather than waiting for the inevitable knock, Thomas dressed quickly in jeans and a flannel shirt, then descended to his kitchen to put on coffee. If experience had taught him anything during his government career, it was that confrontations went smoother when you controlled the initial interaction. Appearing prepared rather than surprised often established a more favorable dynamic. As predicted, a firm knock came at precisely 4:30 a.m. Thomas opened the door before the second knock, coming face to face with a woman in her 40s whose tailored, dark suit couldn't quite conceal the holster at her hip. Despite the early hour, she appeared fully alert, her short, grey-streaked hair and direct gaze projecting authority. "Mr. Caldwell?" she inquired, her tone professional but not hostile. "That would be me," Thomas replied evenly. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some, before you explain why there's a tactical team surrounding my house before sunrise." A flicker of surprise crossed her face before her professional mask returned. "Special Agent Diana Reynolds, Department of Defense Historical Recovery Unit. This is my colleague, Dr. Marcus Hoffman." She gestured to a rumpled academic-looking man beside her who nodded awkwardly. "Historical recovery." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's a new one." "May we come in, Mr. Caldwell?" Reynolds asked, ignoring his comment. "What we need to discuss is classified." Thomas stepped aside, noting the subtle hand signal Reynolds gave to the tactical team, instructing them to maintain their positions rather than enter. Interesting. They weren't treating him as a threat, despite the show of force. In his kitchen, Thomas poured coffee for his unexpected visitors. Reynolds accepted with a nod of thanks, while Dr. Hoffman immediately pulled out a tablet and began swiping through images. "You discovered something unusual while plowing yesterday," Reynolds stated rather than asked. "I did," Thomas confirmed, leaning against the counter. "Though I'm curious how you know that, and why it warrants a pre-dawn visit with enough manpower to secure a hostile location." Reynolds studied him for a moment before responding. "Your military service record indicates 22 years in Army intelligence, including specialized analysis of historical European military infrastructure. That background, combined with what appears to be a German bunker from World War II on American soil, creates a unique security situation." "Cloud backup," Thomas realized aloud. "My phone automatically uploaded the photos." Reynolds nodded. "Artificial intelligence monitoring systems flagged the images due to the visible insignia. Given your background and the nature of the discovery, certain protocols were automatically initiated." Dr. Hoffman finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight German accent. "Mr. Caldwell, what you've discovered is potentially extraordinary. Based on the preliminary images, the construction appears consistent with a specific type of command bunker designed by Organization Thawed between 1943 and 1944. The presence of such a structure on American soil would be historically unprecedented. Thomas processed this information, his analytical mind already connecting implications. "You believe this is an authentic Nazi installation rather than something constructed later for training purposes. The metallurgical composition and design, elements visible in your photographs suggest authentic period construction," Hoffman replied. "If confirmed, this would represent a significant historical discovery with potential security implications." What kind of security implications could a 78-year-old bunker possibly have? Thomas asked, though he could think of several concerning scenarios. Reynolds set down her coffee cup. That's what we intend to find out. Mr. Caldwell, we'll need you to show us exactly where you found the entrance and provide any additional information about your discovery. And if I refuse until I see proper documentation and authorization? Thomas countered, not because he intended to obstruct, but because years in intelligence had taught him to establish boundaries early when dealing with government operatives. For the first time, Reynolds smiled slightly. Your security clearance was never fully deactivated, Mr. Caldwell. It's been temporarily reinstated to Sigma-7 for this operation, which should tell you all you need to know about both our authorization and the potential significance of what you've found. The reference to Sigma-7, a classification level Thomas hadn't heard mentioned in over a decade, signaled legitimate high-level interest. This wasn't a routine historical investigation, but something with national security implications, serious enough to warrant emergency clearance protocols. The North Field, Thomas said after a moment's consideration. I can take you there now, but I'd appreciate if your tactical team would avoid trampling my newly planted eastern section. Reynolds nodded. They've been instructed to stick to established pathways. We anticipated your cooperation. As they prepared to leave for the site, Thomas glanced out his kitchen window at the increasing activity around his farm. Additional vehicles had arrived, including what appeared to be specialized ground-penetrating radar equipment being unloaded from a military transport truck. Whatever he had discovered was significant enough to mobilize substantial resources. With remarkable speed, Dr. Hoffman approached, holding his tablet. Before we proceed, I'd like to show you something. He displayed a historical photograph of a group of German military officers standing beside architectural drawings. Are you familiar with Operation Pastorius? German sabotage attempt in 1942, Thomas replied automatically. 8 agents were inserted by submarine on American shores, but were captured before they could carry out their mission. Correct. Hoffman nodded, impressed. What's less known is that Pastorius was merely the first phase of a more ambitious operation, codenamed Eisenhammer, that would have established permanent forward operating bases on American soil for long-term. Infiltration and sabotage activities. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early morning air. You think that's what I've found? An advanced Nazi operating base on American soil? If I'm right, Hoffman said quietly, what you've discovered could fundamentally alter our understanding of German operations in North America during the war. The question isn't just what's in that bunker, Mr. Caldwell. It's whether anyone else knew it was there all this time. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Thomas considered the implications. His quiet life as a farmer had just become considerably more complicated, all because his plow had struck metal in a field his family had owned for generations without ever suspecting what lay beneath. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern ridge as Thomas led the government team. Across his north field, the overnight dew made the freshly turned soil stick to their boots, creating a strange procession of deepening footprints leading to the orange survey flag marking his discovery. Despite the early hour, the operation had expanded considerably. Thomas counted at least 20 personnel, establishing a secure perimeter around the site, with specialized equipment being positioned at strategic intervals. We've established a 10-meter exclusion zone, Reynolds explained as they approached. Ground-penetrating radar conducted during the night indicates the structure extends approximately 40 feet below surface level, with what appears to be multiple chambers. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You've been busy while I was sleeping. Standard protocol for potential Umbra-classified discoveries, Reynolds replied matter-of-factly. The reference to Umbra, a code word Thomas hadn't heard since his active intelligence days, confirmed his suspicions about the seriousness with which the government was treating his discovery. Umbra designation was reserved for intelligence so sensitive that mere knowledge of its existence required presidential-level clearance. At the site, the metal hatch Thomas had uncovered was now completely exposed, surrounded by portable lights and monitoring equipment. Additional soil had been carefully removed, revealing more of the Nazi insignia, an eagle clutching a swastika, now unmistakable in the morning light. Dr. Hoffman crouched beside the hatch, carefully photographing details of the locking mechanism. "Magnificent craftsmanship," he murmured, almost to himself. "This is consistent with Sonderführung construction, specialized engineering units that designed Hitler's most secure facilities. The presence of this level of engineering expertise on American soil is unprecedented." "Have you tried opening it?" Thomas asked, noting the untouched appearance of the mechanism. "We were waiting for the structural integrity team to complete their assessment," Reynolds explained. "Underground facilities of this age can be unstable, and there's always the possibility of booby traps or degraded chemical agents." As if on cue, a woman in specialized equipment approached. "Structural assessment complete," she reported. "The facility appears remarkably intact. Atmospheric samples from around the seal show elevated CO2 levels, but no chemical weapons signatures or dangerous biological contaminants," Reynolds nodded. "Proceed with entry protocol." What followed was a methodical, almost ceremonial procedure. A specialist photographed, measured, and analyzed every aspect of the entrance before attempting to breach it. Thomas watched with professional interest, recognizing the detailed protocols. From his own training in accessing potentially compromised foreign installations. "Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Hoffman said quietly, joining him at the perimeter, "I'm curious. How long has your family owned this land?" "Since 1919, Thomas replied. "My great-grandfather purchased it after returning from the First World War." Hoffman nodded thoughtfully. "And there were never any rumors or stories about unusual construction or unexplained activity in this area during the 1940s? "None that I'm aware of," Thomas said, "though most of the men from this region were serving overseas during that period. The farms were primarily operated by women, children, and older men who remained behind, which would have created an ideal environment for covert activity," Hoffman mused. "Reduced local workforce, many experienced observers absent, and a patriotic population unlikely to question unusual government activities presented as war-related work." Before Thomas could respond, a technician called out, "We have preliminary access." The gathered specialist fell silent as two operators in protective gear carefully manipulated the sophisticated locking mechanism. After several tense minutes, there was a distinct metallic click, followed by the hiss of escaping air, suggesting the bunker had maintained some form of atmospheric seal for decades. "Remarkable," Hoffman whispered. "A perfect vacuum seal after all these years." The heavy metal hatch swung open with surprising ease, revealing a dark shaft with metal rungs embedded in the concrete wall, descending into darkness. Powerful lights were immediately positioned around the opening, illuminating what appeared to be a professionally engineered access shaft leading deep underground. "Atmospheric team, proceed with initial assessment," Reynolds ordered. Two specialists, in full protective gear, began a careful descent into the shaft, carrying equipment to analyze air quality and detect any potential hazards. The tension around the site was palpable as everyone waited for their initial report. After what seemed like an eternity, a voice crackled over the radio. "Atmospheric conditions stable. Oxygen levels at 19.4%, slightly below normal but within safe parameters. No detection of chemical agents or biological hazards. Temperature consistent at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. We've reached what appears to be a main chamber, approximately 30 feet below surface level." Reynolds nodded to the tactical team. Establish secure entry protocol. Dr. Hoffman, you're authorized for initial documentation once the area is secured. To Thomas's surprise, Reynolds turned to him next. Mr. Caldwell, given your background and the fact that this is technically your property, you're cleared to accompany the initial assessment team, if you're willing. The offer confirmed Thomas's suspicion that his reinstatement to Sigma-7 clearance wasn't merely procedural courtesy, but indicated genuine interest in his analytical perspective on whatever lay below. Of course, he replied simply. 20 minutes later, Thomas found himself descending the metal rungs into a piece of history that had literally been buried beneath his farm for generations. The shaft was remarkably well engineered, concrete-lined, with steel reinforcement that showed minimal corrosion despite decades underground. The craftsmanship was distinctly European, with a precision that American construction of the era rarely matched. At the bottom of the shaft, Thomas stepped into what appeared to be an antechamber roughly 15 feet square. The walls were constructed of reinforced concrete with German efficiency markings still visible. Battery-powered lights had been positioned throughout the space, revealing a facility in a remarkable state of preservation. "This level of preservation is extraordinary," Dr. Hoffman commented, carefully photographing original German signage on the walls. The engineering created a microclimate that has essentially suspended time down here. 3 armored doors led from the antechamber, each bearing different insignia and security classifications in German. The tactical team had already secured the central doorway, establishing a preliminary command post with communications equipment linked to the surface. The initial sweep indicates at least 7 interconnected chambers, Reynolds explained, consulting. A digital schematic being updated in real time as the exploration continued. What appears to be living quarters, communications equipment, and some form of document storage. "Any indications of weapons or explosives?" Thomas asked, professional, instincts from his intelligence days automatically assessing threat possibilities. "Nothing immediate, but we're proceeding with full EOD protocols, just in case," Reynolds replied, referring to explosive ordnance disposal procedures. Dr. Hoffman had moved to examine what appeared to be a logbook secured in a wall-mounted case. This is extraordinary," he breathed, carefully photographing each page without touching the fragile document. According to these entries, this facility was operational from June 1943 until at least April 1945, deep into the final phase of the European War, when Germany was collapsing. Thomas joined him, his intelligence training allowing him to decipher the archaic German military abbreviations. "These are communication logs," he noted. "They were receiving transmissions from Berlin until very near the end." Reynolds approached, with renewed interest. "Can you determine the nature of the communications?" Thomas studied the entries carefully. "It appears they were primarily receiving rather than transmitting. Intelligence updates, operational directives. These codes here suggest they were part of something called Project Valhalla. I'm not familiar with that designation." Dr. Hoffman's expression changed dramatically. Project Valhalla was a theoretical last resort operation designed to continue the Reich beyond German defeat. A fortress beyond Europe concept. Most historians considered it propaganda rather than an actual operational plan. He looked around the bunker with newfound amazement. If this facility was part of Valhalla, it represents a level of German strategic planning on American soil that fundamentally alters our understanding of the war. The tactical team leader approached with urgent news. "Ma'am, we've accessed what appears to be the primary secure storage area. You need to see this immediately." Reynolds gestured for Thomas and Hoffman to follow as they moved deeper into the underground complex. The facility expanded into a larger chamber, that had clearly served as the bunker's operational center. Original maps still hung on the walls, showing detailed layouts of industrial centers across the American Northeast, with key infrastructure marked for what could only be interpreted as potential sabotage targets. But it was the reinforced vault at the chamber's far end that had captured the tactical team's attention. The heavy steel door stood open, revealing row upon row of preserved document cases, equipment crates, and what appeared to be prototypes of devices Thomas didn't recognize. Initial assessment suggests these are technical documents, the team leader reported. But there's something else. He led them to a specific crate, where his team had carefully removed protective covering to reveal contents that caused even the professional Reynolds to inhale sharply. Inside lay what appeared to be advanced technical schematics, unlike anything from the 1940s, designs for propulsion systems, weapons platforms, and communication devices that seemed decades ahead of what should have been possible during that era. These designs are anomalous, Dr. Hoffman stated, the academic understatement barely concealing his shock. They appear to incorporate theoretical physics concepts that weren't even hypothesized until the 1960s. Reynolds was already on her secure communication device. This is Reynolds. I need Umbra clearance extended to everything found in Compartment 7 and inform Director Blackwood that we're implementing Indigo Protocol effective immediately. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Indigo Protocol was reserved for discoveries that potentially rewrote fundamental historical narratives with national security implications, essentially evidence that the accepted historical record was deliberately falsified at the highest levels. There's something else you should see, another specialist called from deeper in the vault. We found personnel files, including photographs of the German operatives stationed here. One of them might be relevant to Mr. Caldwell. Thomas followed, with mounting confusion, until the specialist handed him a preserved personnel folder. Inside was a black-and-white photograph of a German officer in Wehrmacht uniform, a man whose features were hauntingly familiar. This looks like my great-grandfather," Thomas said, staring at the image in disbelief. "But that's impossible. He was an American soldier in the First World War." Dr. Hoffman and Reynolds exchanged significant glances. "Mr. Caldwell," Reynolds said carefully, "I think we need to have a much more detailed conversation about your family history and how your ancestors came to acquire this particular piece of land in 1919 and in 19... As the implications sank in, Thomas realized that the history of both his family and his country might be far different from what he had always believed, and that the truth had literally been buried beneath his feet for generations, waiting for a farmer's plow to uncover secrets that powerful interests had worked very hard to keep hidden. Thomas sat in a hastily established debriefing room within a secure tent on his own property, staring at the personnel file spread before him. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The man he had known as his great-grandfather, John Caldwell, the decorated American WWI veteran whose war stories had inspired his own military service, appeared to have been living a carefully constructed lie. The German personnel file identified him as Johann Kaltenbrunner, a Geheime Staatspolizei intelligence officer assigned to Operation Valhalla in 1943. The documentation was meticulous, including his training records, ideological assessment, and specialized skills that made him suited for deep cover operations on American soil. "This can't be right," Thomas said, looking up at Reynolds and Hoffman. "My great-grandfather had an American birth certificate. He served in the U.S. Army during the First World War. He had medals, documentation. False identities were a specialty of certain Gestapo units," Hoffman explained gently. "They excelled at creating comprehensive cover stories that could withstand considerable scrutiny, particularly in the pre-digital era, when records existed only on paper and verification was cumbersome." Reynolds slid another document across the table, a classified intelligence report dated 1946. This may help explain the situation, Mr. Caldwell. After the war, U.S. counterintelligence identified several German deep-cover operatives who had successfully integrated into American society. However, by then, a different national security concern had emerged. The Soviet threat, Thomas concluded, immediately understanding the implications. The beginning of the Cold War. Precisely, Reynolds nodded. According to this report, certain German operatives with specialized technical knowledge or intelligence expertise were offered a choice: prosecution for espionage or complete immunity in exchange for cooperation against the new Soviet threat. Thomas scanned the document with growing unease. Operation Paperclip, he murmured, recognizing the classified program that had recruited German scientists for American research programs after Waterloo. This appears to be a parallel program focused on intelligence assets rather than scientific ones, Hoffman confirmed. The Germans had developed extensive networks and methodologies for operating in hostile territory. Expertise American intelligence agencies were eager to acquire as tensions with the Soviets escalated. The document contained a list of German operatives who had accepted the immunity offer, including Johann Kaltenbrunner, now permanently established as John Caldwell, with notation indicating his expertise in agricultural land management as ideal cover for continued residence near the buried bunker facility. They didn't just let him stay, Thomas realized, the truth dawning with sickening clarity. They deliberately kept him positioned here to maintain secrecy about the bunker. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a caretaker, making sure this place remained hidden. Reynolds nodded. Based on these documents, the U.S. government made a strategic decision to keep this facility undisturbed rather than risk exposure during a recovery operation. Your great-grandfather's continued presence provided natural security, a local resident with legitimate reason to be on the property who could monitor for any accidental discoveries. Thomas struggled to reconcile this revelation with his family history. But my grandfather, his son, served in the Pacific during World War II. He fought against the Axis powers. The perfect cover, Hoffman noted. What better way to cement an American identity than having a son serving in the U.S. military? It would deflect any possible suspicion. A new, disturbing thought occurred to Thomas. Did my grandfather know? What about my father? Reynolds's expression softened slightly, the first genuine empathy she had shown. We don't have that information. Mr. Caldwell, it's possible your great-grandfather was the only family member aware of the truth. Compartmentalization was standard procedure in these scenarios. Thomas stood abruptly, needing physical movement to process the psychological impact of these revelations. His entire family narrative, the heritage he had taken pride in, was apparently constructed on elaborate deception. The American veteran, whose principles had shaped generations of Caldwells, had actually been a Nazi intelligence officer hiding in plain sight. I need some air, he said simply, moving toward the tent entrance. Of course, Reynolds agreed, but please remain within the security perimeter. This operation is still classified at the highest levels. Outside, the April morning had blossomed into a perfect spring day that seemed cruelly at odds with the darkness of the revelations below ground. Thomas's farm had been transformed into a hive of activity. Additional military vehicles, specialized equipment, and personnel with various areas of expertise continued to arrive, establishing what was becoming a major operation centered around the bunker entrance. Thomas found a quiet spot near the edge of the security perimeter, watching as his normally peaceful farm fields swarmed with government activity. After several minutes, Dr. Hoffman approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need this, the historian said, offering one to Thomas. Thanks, Thomas replied, accepting the cup. I'm still trying to process all this. Hoffman nodded sympathetically. It's a profound shock to have one's family history recontextualized so dramatically. If it helps, you're not responsible for his actions or decisions, but I am responsible for what happens next, Thomas said firmly. This is still my land, and whatever is in that bunker clearly has significant implications. I want to understand what we're dealing with. Hoffman seemed to weigh his words carefully before responding. The technical documents we've recovered so far are extraordinary. They appear to incorporate theoretical concepts decades ahead of conventional engineering of that era. Some designs resemble technologies that weren't developed until the 1970s, while others describe systems we still haven't successfully implemented. That's impossible, Thomas stated flatly. Even the most brilliant German engineers couldn't have leapfrogged decades of technological development. Under normal circumstances, I would agree, Hoffman said. But there's another document category. We've discovered that might explain the discrepancy. He hesitated, then continued more quietly. Are you familiar with Die Glock? Thomas frowned. The bell? It was supposed to be some kind of Nazi wonder weapon, mostly considered a post-war myth or propaganda. That's the official position, Hoffman confirmed. But these documents reference it as a real project, specifically as the source of technological insights that informed these advanced designs. According to these records, Die Glock was an experimental device that created what they termed temporal displacement fields, essentially windows into potential future technological developments. Time travel? Thomas asked incredulously. You're suggesting the Nazis were experimenting with seeing the future, not physical time travel, Hoffman clarified. More like information transfer across temporal boundaries. The documentation is highly technical, but it suggests they discovered a method to receive limited data from future timelines, fragmentary technical insights rather than complete technologies. Before Thomas could respond to this extraordinary claim, Reynolds approached briskly. Dr. Hoffman, you're needed in the main chamber immediately. The technical team has accessed what appears to be a sealed research area. Hoffman excused himself, leaving Thomas to grapple with implications that stretched far beyond his family's secret history. If these documents were authentic, they suggested a technological reality that fundamentally altered understanding of both history and physics. Thomas followed at a distance, his security clearance allowing him to observe as the operation continued to expand. Near the bunker entrance, he noticed a new group of arrivals. Individuals in civilian clothing whose bearing and positioning nonetheless marked them as military or intelligence personnel. Unlike the other teams, they established a separate communication system and appeared to be operating under different command protocols. One of these newcomers, a tall, silver-haired man with the physically fit appearance of someone who had maintained military discipline well into his 60s, broke away from the group and approached Thomas directly. Mr. Caldwell, he said without introduction, I'm Director James Blackwood, Special Projects Division. Walk with me, please. The authoritative tone made it clear this wasn't a request. As they moved away from the operational center to a more private area, Thomas noted the reaction of other personnel. Even Reynolds had straightened perceptibly when Blackwood arrived, suggesting a significant authority presence. Your farm has become the center of a rather sensitive situation, Blackwood began, once they were alone. One with implications beyond what most of the personnel here are cleared to understand, including me, Thomas asked directly. Blackwood smiled slightly. Your Sigma-7 clearance gives you access to more than most, but no, the full context remains restricted to necessary operational knowledge. However, your unique position as both property owner and someone with relevant intelligence background creates an unusual circumstance. What exactly does the Special Projects Division do, Director Blackwood? Thomas asked. recognizing the carefully constructed vagueness in the man's statements. "We manage historical contingencies," Blackwood replied after a moment's consideration. "Situations where the accepted historical narrative and actual events diverge in ways that could impact national security if broadly known." "You're talking about covering up the truth," Thomas translated bluntly. "I'm talking about contextualizing information whose unmanaged release could destabilize current geopolitical relationships without providing compensatory benefits," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "History is more complex than most people realize, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes the simplified version serves greater stability than the messy reality." Thomas studied the man carefully. "Why are you telling me this? I assume it's not standard procedure to explain your cover-up philosophy to civilians." "Because you're now part of a historical contingency," Blackwood said directly. "Your discovery has activated protocols established decades ago for precisely this scenario. The question becomes whether you'll be part of the managed resolution, or a complication requiring additional measures. The veiled threat wasn't subtle." Thomas maintained his composed exterior while his mind raced through implications and options. His military intelligence background had taught him to recognize when he was being positioned for manipulation. "What exactly do you want from me, Director?" he asked directly. "Your cooperation and discretion," Blackwood replied. "The official narrative will be that your property is being temporarily utilized for a classified historical preservation project related to Cold War infrastructure. Technically true, while omitting significant details. You'll receive generous compensation for both land use and operational inconvenience, along with a binding non-disclosure agreement." "And if I find that arrangement insufficient?" Thomas challenged. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but his tone cooled noticeably. "Then we would need to explore alternative approaches, which would be considerably less convenient for all parties. National security priorities would ultimately prevail, Mr. Caldwell, by whatever means necessary." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion near the bunker entrance drew their attention. Emergency protocols had activated. Personnel were being rapidly evacuated from the underground facility, while specialized hazmat teams deployed with urgency that suggested a significant development. Reynolds spotted them and rushed over her, professional composure visibly strained. "Director, we have a situation." The research chamber contained an active device, some kind of experimental apparatus that was dormant until the sealed environment was disrupted. It's emitting energy signatures unlike anything we've encountered. "Containment status?" Blackwood demanded, immediately shifting to operational focus. "Uncertain," Reynolds admitted. "The energy patterns are inconsistent with known physics. Dr. Hoffman believes it may be the actual prototype of Glock referenced in the documentation." Thomas watched as Blackwood's calculated demeanor fractured momentarily, revealing genuine concern. "Implement Omega protocols immediately, full evacuation to minimum safe distance, and get our quantum physics team airdropped here. Priority override on all other deployments." As Reynolds rushed to implement these orders, Blackwood turned back to Thomas, all pretense of casual conversation abandoned. "It appears your family farm has been sitting atop something considerably more significant than a simple intelligence bunker, Mr. Caldwell. The next 24 hours will determine whether this is merely an extraordinary historical discovery or something far more consequential for our current understanding of reality." The evacuation expanded rapidly, with personnel and equipment being repositioned to a perimeter nearly half a mile from the bunker entrance. Whatever had been awakened beneath Thomas's farm, it had transformed a classified historical operation into something that had the most senior officials visibly concerned about immediate safety risks. As Thomas watched his peaceful farmland become the center of what was clearly evolving into a major scientific and security crisis, he wondered how many other secrets remained buried beneath the surface of accepted reality, and what other historical contingencies were managed by people like Blackwood, who decided which truths the public could handle and which would remain hidden behind classifications and convenient narratives. By mid-afternoon, Thomas's farm had been transformed into something resembling a military base during active crisis. 3 concentric security perimeters had been established around the bunker entrance, with specialized scientific equipment positioned at calculated intervals to monitor whatever was happening underground. Heavy transport helicopters had delivered additional personnel and equipment, including a mobile laboratory complex that now dominated what had been Thomas's East Field. From his position at the command center, where he remained partly as a courtesy due to his property ownership, and partly because his Sigma-7 clearance made excluding him more complicated than allowing his presence, Thomas watched the controlled chaos with professional interest. Dr. Hoffman had joined a team of newly arrived scientists gathered around monitoring equipment. Their animated discussion, though technically beyond Thomas's hearing range, clearly indicated significant developments that defied standard assessment. In protocols, energy output has increased by 47% in the past hour, reported a physicist Thomas had heard addressed as Dr. Chen. The signature is still maintaining that unusual temporal oscillation pattern, but the amplitude is growing. "Are we recording any radiation leakage beyond the primary containment area?" asked another scientist, this one wearing what appeared to be specialized monitoring equipment clipped to her hazmat suit. "Nothing harmful in conventional terms," Chen replied, studying readouts with furrowed brow. "But these tachyon measurements are unprecedented. According to these readings, the device is generating particles that are moving backward through time, theoretically impossible according to our current understanding of physics." Director Blackwood had established his operational position slightly, removed from the scientific teams, surrounded by communications equipment and senior personnel who appeared to be coordinating with distant authorities. His expression had transformed from the calculated control of earlier interactions to something Thomas recognized from crisis operations, the focused intensity of someone balancing multiple catastrophic possibilities against limited response options. Thomas approached Reynolds, who was coordinating between the scientific assessment teams and Blackwood's command group. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" he asked directly. Reynolds hesitated, then apparently decided his clearance, and personal stake justified a substantive response. The documents identified the device as Die Glocke, a prototype developed under Hans Kammler's SS Special Projects Division in late 1944. According to the technical specifications, it was designed to manipulate what they called temporal energy fields for both intelligence gathering and weapons applications. "You're talking about a time machine," Thomas stated flatly. "Not exactly," Reynolds corrected. "Based on the documentation and current readings, it doesn't physically transport matter through time. It creates a field that allows certain types of information exchange between temporal points, essentially a window rather than a door." The Nazi scientists believed this would allow them to access future technological developments and potentially communicate with future operatives. Thomas processed this extraordinary claim with the analytical detachment his intelligence background had instilled. Even if that were theoretically possible, why would such a device suddenly activate after lying dormant for over 7 decades? Dr. Hoffman, who had overheard the question, joined their conversation. "According to the technical manuals we've translated, Die Glocke was designed with a self-sustaining power source based on principles that still defy conventional understanding. When the sealed chamber was opened, the environmental change apparently triggered a reactivation sequence. And now it's what, calling home to Nazi Germany? Thomas asked with deliberate skepticism. That's where things become concerning, Hoffman replied, lowering his voice despite the ambient operational noise. The temporal targeting mechanism appears to be active, but the coordinates it's attempting to connect with aren't in the past. Thomas felt a chill of understanding. It's looking forward, attempting to connect with something in our future. Exactly, Reynolds confirmed grimly, and the energy signature is growing stronger, suggesting it might be receiving a response. Before Thomas could process the implications of this revelation, Director Blackwood approached, his face set in grim determination. Dr. Hoffman, you're needed with the translation team immediately. They've accessed what appears to be the operational logs from the final days before the facility was sealed. As Hoffman rushed to join the document team, Blackwood turned to Thomas. Mr. Caldwell, I need to be perfectly clear about the situation we're facing. What's happening beneath your farm has rapidly evolved from a historical curiosity to a potential first contact scenario with profound national security implications. First contact, Thomas repeated. You're talking as if this is an alien technology. Not alien, Blackwood corrected, but possibly representing a level of human technological development far beyond our current capabilities. If this device is successfully establishing communication with a point in our future timeline, we could be facing an informational paradox with unpredictable consequences. A young analyst interrupted with urgent news. Director, the translation team has preliminary findings from the final log entries. You need to see this immediately. Thomas followed, as Blackwood moved quickly to the document analysis station, where Hoffman and several linguists were examining digital scans of handwritten journals recovered from the sealed research chamber. We've translated the final entries. From April 16, 1945, Hoffman reported, his academic demeanor strained by evident excitement or concern. According to these records, the research team activated Die Glocke as Berlin was falling, attempting to transmit their accumulated research to what they believed would be a future incarnation of the Reich. The final entry indicates they successfully established contact with a temporal coordinate approximately 80 years in their future, which would be now. That's impossible, one of the scientists objected. Even if we accept the theoretical possibility of temporal information exchange, the statistical probability of precisely targeting a specific future moment would be infinitesimal. Unless, Blackwood said slowly, the connection was established from both endpoints simultaneously. If the future side of the exchange was also actively seeking connection with this specific historical moment, the implications silenced even the most skeptical scientific observers. If Blackwood's assessment was correct, something or someone in the present day had been waiting for the bunker to be discovered and the device to be reactivated, effectively creating a predetermined temporal rendezvous across 80 years. Sir, interrupted a monitoring technician, the energy signature has stabilized and appears to be modulating in a pattern consistent with data transmission. We're detecting information flow in both directions. Lock it down, Blackwood ordered immediately. Full containment protocols. Nothing gets in or out of that chamber until we understand exactly what's being communicated. Too late, sir, the technician replied with professional calm, belied by whitened knuckles on his console. The transmission appears to have completed. Approximately 40 seconds ago, a tense silence fell over the command center as the implications registered. Whatever information exchange had been 80 years in the making had already occurred. Historical Nazi research flowing forward to the present day, and potentially modern knowledge flowing backward to 1945. Full facility quarantine, Blackwood ordered. I want everything that's been removed from that bunker secured for Level 9 containment transport. All personnel with direct exposure to the device or documentation are subject to comprehensive debriefing before clearance. As the containment procedures accelerated around him, Thomas found himself processing the extraordinary possibilities this discovery represented. If the Nazi scientists had indeed created a technology capable of transmitting information across time, the implications extended far beyond historical curiosity or even national security. This represented a fundamental challenge to humanity's understanding of causality and temporal progression. Mr. Caldwell, Blackwood addressed him directly. Given the escalated situation, I'm authorizing your temporary consultant status with Special Projects Division. You're now officially part of this operation rather than merely adjacent to it. The shift wasn't merely administrative. It represented Blackwood's recognition that excluding Thomas had become more problematic than incorporating him into the controlled information flow. It also, Thomas recognized, placed him under more direct operational authority and expanded confidentiality requirements. What exactly do you think happened here today, Director? Thomas asked directly. Blackwood considered his response carefully before answering. Best case scenario, we've witnessed an extraordinary but ultimately historical technological anomaly. Impressive, but limited in current implications. Worst case. He paused, glancing toward the bunker entrance where containment measures continued to intensify. We may have just observed the completion of the longest intelligence operation in human history. Nazi research from 1945 successfully transmitted to waiting recipients in our present. Recipients who would be who, exactly? Thomas pressed. Are you suggesting some kind of neo-Nazi organization has been waiting for this moment? That would actually be less concerning than some possibilities, Blackwood admitted. Ideological extremists we understand and can counter through established methods. But if the recipients are more sophisticated, perhaps a technological organization or even a state actor with advanced capabilities, the strategic implications become considerably more complex. A commotion near the document analysis station interrupted their conversation. Dr. Hoffman was urgently calling for Blackwood's attention, waving what appeared to be a recently translated page with evident agitation. Director, we've found something critical in the personnel files, Hoffman reported as they approached. The final entry references a contingency protocol called Götterdämmerung that was to be implemented if the facility was discovered before. The predetermined activation timeline. It includes a list of sleeper assets positioned in the vicinity with instructions to monitor for certain trigger events. Sleeper assets? Thomas questioned. In Somerset County? That's absurd. This is rural Pennsylvania farm country. That's why it would be effective, Reynolds noted. Deep cover operatives in locations no one would think to look, positioned to maintain generational surveillance on critical sites. Hoffman continued with growing concern. According to this document, these assets were instructed to take specific actions if the bunker was discovered prematurely, including implementing something called Protocol Fenrir to prevent untargeted temporal information exchange. They left guards, Blackwood translated grimly, and if your family wasn't part of that monitoring network as we initially suspected, then there are likely others nearby who were tasked with taking action if this facility was ever exposed. As if in response to his assessment, the perimeter security channel erupted with urgent communications. Breach at Southern Checkpoint, reported a tactical officer. Local vehicle approaching at high speed, driver not responding to warnings. Thomas moved instinctively to the monitoring station, where security camera feeds showed a battered pickup truck smashing through the outer perimeter barriers, heading directly toward the bunker entrance with evident purpose. Subject is male, approximately 70 to 80 years old, reported the security officer. Local resident according to vehicle registration. Samuel Werner lives approximately 3 miles from this location. The name triggered immediate recognition for Thomas. Werner, the old dairy farm down by the creek. They've been here as long as my family has. As tactical teams moved to intercept the rapidly approaching vehicle, Thomas realized with sudden clarity that his quiet farming community likely contained other families, with histories as carefully constructed as his own had been. Descendants of those who had been positioned decades ago to guard secrets buried beneath Pennsylvania soil, waiting for this precise moment when the past would reach forward to make contact with whatever inheritors of Nazi scientific ambition might exist in the 21st century. The pickup truck skidded to a halt 50 yards from the bunker entrance, as tactical teams established a containment perimeter around it. The elderly driver remained motionless behind the wheel, his weathered face visible through the windshield as he surveyed the extraordinary operation that had transformed his neighbors' farm into a government stronghold. "I know him," Thomas said, watching the standoff from the command center's monitoring station. "Sam Werner. His family has owned the neighboring dairy farm since before my grandfather's time. He's just a local farmer, hardly some Nazi sleeper." "Agent?" "Appearances can be deceiving," Reynolds replied, studying the tactical feed with professional assessment, particularly when deception has been maintained across generations. The tactical team had established standard containment protocols, weapons trained on the vehicle, while a negotiator attempted communication through a loudspeaker. Werner appeared unresponsive to the commands, simply sitting in his truck with an unsettling calm that suggested neither confusion nor fear. "Let me talk to him," Thomas suggested. "He knows me. If this is some misunderstanding, I might be able to diffuse it before someone gets hurt." Blackwood considered the request briefly before nodding. "Maintain tactical coverage, but allow Mr. Caldwell to establish communication. We need information more than we need another body at this point." With an earpiece connecting him to the command center, Thomas approached the perimeter, conscious of the multiple weapons trained on both Werner and himself as a precautionary measure. The elderly farmer watched his approach with an unreadable expression, neither hostile nor welcoming. "Sam," Thomas called when he reached speaking distance. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted area." Werner studied him for a long moment before responding. "They told me your plow found something in the north field. Figured I'd better come see for myself." The deliberate vagueness raised immediate questions. "Who told you, Sam?" "Folks talk," Werner replied evasively. "Small community like ours, word travels fast when government vehicles start pouring into a quiet farm." Thomas maintained a conversational tone despite the tension. "That doesn't explain why you rammed through a security checkpoint to get here." A thin smile crossed Werner's weathered face. "Wasn't sure they'd let me in if I asked politely. And I needed to see what you found, what your grandfather tried to keep hidden all these years." The specific reference to his grandfather caught Thomas's attention. "My grandfather? He died when I was 13. What would he have known about what's buried in this field?" "More than he ever told you, clearly," Werner replied. His gaze shifted toward the bunker entrance, where containment protocols had intensified since the energy discharge. "They've opened it, haven't they? The chamber is active again." The specific terminology, particularly "again," confirmed that Werner possessed knowledge no ordinary farmer should have. Thomas decided to test how much the man actually knew. "You mean Die Glock? The bell?" Werner's eyes snapped back to Thomas, a flash of genuine surprise crossing his features. "They've told you about it already. That's unexpected. The protocols were quite specific about containment procedures if the facility was discovered prematurely." "What? Protocols, Sam?" Thomas pressed. "What's your connection to all this?" The elderly farmer seemed to come to a decision. He slowly raised his hands to show they were empty, then reached deliberately toward the glove compartment. "May I? There's something you need to see, no weapons, just documents. After receiving clearance through his earpiece from the tactical commander, Thomas nodded. Slowly, Werner carefully opened the glove compartment and removed an aged leather portfolio. "Catch," he said, tossing it underhanded to Thomas. The portfolio contained what appeared to be original documents from the 1940s, including a photograph that made Thomas's breath catch. It showed two men in civilian clothing standing beside a newly constructed barn, a structure Thomas recognized as still standing on the Werner property. One was clearly a younger version of Sam's father, whom Thomas had met as a child. The other, to his shock, was his own grandfather, but it was the handwritten note clipped to the photograph that proved most disturbing. Surveillance rotation established. Caldwell monitors primary site. Werner maintains secondary containment protocols. Monthly verification continuing as directed. Our families weren't enemies, Werner explained, watching Thomas's reaction carefully. We were partners, assigned to different aspects of the same mission. Your grandfather's responsibility was direct monitoring of the facility. Mine was countermeasure implementation if containment was breached. Countermeasures? Thomas questioned, already suspecting the answer. Insurance policy, Werner confirmed grimly. If the facility was compromised before the designated activation timeline, my family was tasked with implementing Protocol Fenrir, essentially controlled destruction of the entire site to prevent unintended temporal exchange. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear Blackwood issuing urgent containment orders based on this revelation. The tactical teams subtly adjusted their positions, preparing for potential threat response while maintaining the appearance of routine security. "So you came here to what? Blow up my farm?" Thomas asked, maintaining a calm he didn't entirely feel. Werner shook his head slightly. "If that was my intention, this conversation wouldn't be happening. No, I came to verify activation status. The energy signature was detectable from my property, specific frequencies we were trained to monitor through generations. Once I confirmed activation had occurred, protocol actually requires me to stand down." "Why would your destructive contingency be cancelled after activation rather than implemented?" Reynolds asked through Thomas's earpiece, clearly skeptical of Werner's explanation. Thomas relayed the question, to which Werner offered a thin smile. "Because successful activation means the transmission has already occurred. Destroying the facility afterward would serve no strategic purpose, while potentially alerting authorities to broader operational concerns." "What transmission?" Thomas pressed. "What exactly was sent, and to whom?" Werner's expression suggested genuine uncertainty. That information was compartmentalized, even within the operational structure. My family maintained physical security protocols without access to the technical aspects. Your grandfather's line was responsible for monitoring the facility's integrity, but similarly lacked detailed knowledge of its purpose. Yet you recognized the term Die Glock immediately, Thomas pointed out. We were given recognition terminology. Without comprehensive understanding, Werner explained. Need to know operational security, standard procedure for long-term assets who might eventually be compromised. The tactical commander interrupted through Thomas's earpiece. "Sir, we're detecting additional vehicle movement approaching from multiple directions. 3 separate vehicles converging on this location via different access roads. This development visibly concerned Werner." "That's not part of our protocol," he said, tension evident in his voice. "There should only be 2 families with operational knowledge in this immediate area, yours and mine." "Then who else would be coming?" Thomas asked, already calculating the strategic implications. "Recipients," Werner replied grimly. "Someone was waiting for the transmission, monitoring for the same energy signature I detected, and now they're converging to secure whatever was exchanged." Blackwood's voice came urgently through the earpiece. "Mr. Caldwell, extract any additional intelligence you can, but prepare to withdraw to the secure perimeter. If Werner's assessment is accurate, we may be facing multiple hostile actors with unknown capabilities and objectives." Thomas recognized the strategic calculation. Information gathering balanced against security protocols. "Sam, I need you to be absolutely clear about something. Was my great-grandfather actually Johann Kaltenbrunner, a German intelligence operative placed here after World War I? The question visibly startled Werner. "Kaltenbrunner? No. Your great-grandfather was George Caldwell, born in Pittsburgh in 1896. It was your grandfather who was recruited during military service in Europe. He wasn't German. He was American, specifically selected for the monitoring role because of his family's established local presence." This revelation contradicted the documentation they'd discovered in the bunker, suggesting either deliberate misinformation or compartmentalized intelligence, even among the German operatives themselves. "Then whose facility is this?" Thomas pressed. "Who built a Nazi bunker on American soil?" "Not Nazi," Werner corrected with unexpected firmness. "Thule society. They operated within the Reich, but maintained distinct objectives and reported through separate command structures. The political aspects were merely convenient coverage for their actual research interests." The Thule Society, a name Thomas recognized from historical records as an occult organization that had influenced early Nazi ideology before being officially disbanded. If Werner was correct, the bunker represented something more complex than straightforward German military operations on American soil. "Sir!" The tactical commander's voice came through with increased urgency. "Approaching vehicles have taken evasive action after encountering our outer checkpoints. They're attempting to circumvent security perimeters through off-road approaches." Blackwood's orders were immediate and decisive. "Full lockdown protocols. Treat all approaching vehicles as hostile. Mr. Caldwell, you are to return to the command center immediately." Thomas relayed the situation to Werner. "We've got multiple vehicles approaching, Sam. People who aren't authorized to be here. I need to know, are they part of your operations network?" The elderly farmer's expression darkened. "No, but their arrival is consistent with contingency scenarios we were briefed about. If the transmission succeeded, interested parties might converge to secure secondary assets." "What secondary assets?" Thomas demanded. "The bell was only part of the research," Werner explained. "The transmission was meant to secure the theoretical data, but there are physical components, prototypes and materials with unique properties that can't be transmitted as information. Those would still hold extraordinary value to certain interests." Through the command channel, Thomas could hear reports of engagement at the perimeter, tactical teams intercepting individuals attempting to breach security through wooded areas surrounding the farm. This was rapidly evolving from a contained historical discovery to an active security crisis with multiple unknown actors. "Mr. Caldwell, return to command immediately," Blackwood ordered through the earpiece, no longer masking the urgency in his tone. "What happens to Sam?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the elderly farmer still sitting calmly in his truck. "Secure him for questioning," came the immediate reply. "He's now a high-value intelligence asset regardless of his historical role." Thomas turned back to Werner. "They want to bring you in for debriefing, Sam. I'd suggest cooperating. Things are escalating quickly." Werner nodded with resignation. "I figured as much. The protocols actually anticipated this scenario. Discovery followed by government containment. We were instructed to provide baseline intelligence while withholding critical operational details." "Which means what exactly?" Thomas asked, as tactical team members approached to secure Werner. The old farmer's weather-lined face showed a hint of the discipline and training that had remained hidden beneath decades of ordinary rural life. It means I'll tell your people what I know, but what I know was deliberately limited from the beginning. The most important aspects were always compartmentalized beyond the knowledge of field assets like our families. As Werner was escorted to a secure holding area, Thomas returned to the command center, where the monitoring stations displayed a tactical situation growing more complex by the minute. At least 5 unauthorized individuals had been intercepted attempting to approach the bunker from different directions, some with specialized equipment that suggested preparation and knowledge beyond what random opportunists might possess. Initial questioning indicates these aren't coordinated teams, Reynolds reported as Thomas rejoined them. They appear to be representatives of different interest groups, all responding to the same energy signature Werner mentioned. Essentially, competing parties all racing to claim whatever was transmitted or remains in the facility. Blackwood's expression was grim as he studied the tactical displays. This is consistent with a sleeper activation protocol. The transmission served as a broadcast trigger, alerting multiple pre-positioned assets that the moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. "How many are we talking about?" Thomas asked, processing the implications of competing interest groups all converging on his farm. "If the historical pattern holds," Hoffman interjected, looking up from the documents he'd been analyzing, "potentially dozens spread across the region. The Thule Society operated on a cellular structure with deliberate separation between operational groups. Each would have established their own continuity protocols across generations." The realization struck Thomas with sudden clarity. His quiet farming community, the rural Pennsylvania countryside he'd known his entire life, had apparently served as the unwitting host to an invisible network of sleeper operatives for over 7 decades. People who had lived as ordinary citizens, while maintaining secret generational obligations tied to whatever extraordinary technology lay beneath his fields. "Dr. Hoffman," Blackwood called, "I need your assessment. Based on the documentation, what exactly was transmitted, and why would multiple interest groups converge to secure secondary assets?" The historian looked uncharacteristically troubled. According to these research logs, Die Glock was primarily developed to transmit theoretical physics discoveries that the Thule scientists believed would fundamentally alter human technological development. The transmission would include mathematical proofs, experimental results, and theoretical frameworks far beyond conventional science of that era. "And the secondary assets?" Reynolds pressed. "Physical components that couldn't be transmitted as pure information," Hoffman explained, "including something they called Element 115, an artificially stabilized transuranic element their research suggested was critical to manipulating what they termed temporal field dynamics. According to these notes, they managed to synthesize a small quantity through processes that shouldn't have been possible with 1940s technology. The implications silenced even Blackwood momentarily. Element 115, moscovium in the modern periodic table, had only been officially synthesized in extremely small, highly unstable quantities within the past few decades. The suggestion that Nazi-era scientists had not only created it, but stabilized enough for practical application represented a scientific anomaly with profound implications. If these competing interests are converging to secure physical samples of stabilized element 115, Thomas observed, drawing on his intelligence background, we're not just facing a historical curiosity or information security problem, we're potentially dealing with a strategic materials crisis that could rewrite the current balance of power in quantum computing, energy production, and weapons development. Blackwood nodded grimly, which is why this operation has just been elevated to a mega priority. The Pentagon has authorized whatever resources necessary to secure this facility and neutralize all competing interests. regardless of origin or affiliation. As if to emphasize the escalating stakes, the tactical channel erupted with urgent reports of new threats approaching from multiple vectors, now including aerial assets detected moving toward the operational zone at high speed. Thomas's peaceful farm had become the focal point of what was rapidly evolving into a covert conflict between competing factions, all seeking to claim the extraordinary legacy of a scientific breakthrough that had supposedly occurred almost 8 decades earlier. A conflict made possible because generations of ordinary-seeming rural families like his own and Werner's had maintained their secret obligations to monitor and protect whatever lay buried beneath the Pennsylvania soil. Night had fallen over Thomas's farm, transforming the operational zone into a sea of floodlights, security perimeters, and tactical positions. Military helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping the surrounding countryside for additional approaching threats. The peaceful rural landscape Thomas had known his entire life had become unrecognizable. A fortified command center, defending secrets that had lain dormant beneath Pennsylvania soil for generations. In the 6 hours since Werner's arrival, the situation had escalated dramatically. 17 unauthorized individuals had been intercepted attempting to breach security perimeters, some employing sophisticated tactics that suggested professional training. They had been detained in separate, secure facilities established on the eastern edge of Thomas's property, undergoing intensive interrogation that had yielded troubling insights. "They're not coordinated, but they're not random either," Reynolds reported during the latest command briefing. "Each represents a different interest group, private technology firms, suspected foreign intelligence assets, even 2 independent researchers specializing in fringe physics, all responding to the same activation signal but with different objectives. Any commonality in their backgrounds?" Blackwood asked, studying the detainee profiles. "Several have ancestral connections to pre-war European academic institutions with known Thule society associations," Reynolds replied. "It appears to be a generational network designed to activate when Die Glocke transmitted its data." As the command team discussed these findings, the scientific team monitoring the bunker called for urgent attention. "Director, we're detecting a significant change in the energy signature," Dr. Chen reported. "The output patterns are shifting from transmission to what appears to be a containment failure sequence." Blackwood moved immediately to the monitoring station. "Meaning what exactly?" "The device is becoming unstable," Chen explained, pointing to readings that meant nothing to Thomas but clearly alarmed the scientific team. "The temporal field it generates is collapsing in on itself rather than maintaining stable projection. If these readings are accurate, we're looking at a catastrophic containment breach within approximately 45 minutes. "Evacuation radius?" Blackwood asked tersely. Chen's expression was grim. "Based on these energy levels, minimum safe distance would be 20 miles, and that's assuming conventional physics applies, which we can't guarantee given the nature of the technology." The implications silenced the command center momentarily. A 20-mile evacuation in rural Pennsylvania would involve thousands of residents, require hours to implement, and inevitably generate public awareness of a situation the government was desperate to contain. "Do we have any deactivation options?" Reynolds asked. Dr. Hoffman looked up from the technical documents he'd been analyzing. "According to these schematics, Die Glocke was designed with an emergency shutdown sequence, but it requires specific authentication codes known only to the original operators." All eyes turned to Werner, who had remained under guard nearby. The elderly farmer shook his head. "My family's protocols were for external containment only. We weren't given internal deactivation codes, another layer of compartmentalization. "Then we need to implement a physical containment solution," Blackwood decided. "Dr. Chen, what would be required to establish an effective energy barrier around the device?" with the equipment currently available? Impossible in the time frame we have, Chen replied candidly. Our best option would be to attempt to sink the entire facility deeper underground, essentially using Earth mass as natural shielding against whatever energy discharge occurs. Thomas, who had been listening to these exchanges with growing concern, suddenly remembered something from his grandfather's stories, tales he had dismissed as imaginative fiction, but now took on new significance. There might be another option, he said, drawing everyone's attention. My grandfather used to tell stories about a failsafe key hidden somewhere on the property, something only to be used if the earth began to tremble and the sky turned. Wrong. I always thought it was just a bedtime story, but given everything we've learned, where would this key be located? Blackwood asked, immediately grasping the potential significance. The old well house, Thomas replied, remembering details he hadn't thought about in decades. He specifically mentioned that when darkness rises from below, the answer waits in the place where we draw life. The well house, a small stone structure dating back to the 1920s, stood near the original farmhouse, now unused since modern. Plumbing had been installed in the 1960s. Thomas had maintained it out of respect for family history rather than practical necessity. Get a team there immediately, Blackwood ordered. 10 minutes later, Thomas stood inside the old well house with Reynolds and a specialized search team. The stone structure was cool and damp, illuminated by tactical lights that cast long shadows across the moss-covered interior. The well itself was covered by heavy wooden planks, installed decades earlier when the water source was decommissioned. My grandfather specifically mentioned something about beneath the waters, beyond the stone, Thomas recalled, helping the team remove the weathered planks. The well's shaft descended about 30 feet into darkness, its stone walls disappearing into black water below. As the team prepared specialized diving equipment, Thomas noticed something unusual about the stonework just above the waterline. One section appeared subtly different from the surrounding masonry. There, he pointed. That section of stone doesn't match the rest. A tactical team member carefully descended to examine the area, confirming Thomas's observation. It's a concealed compartment, he reported, carefully manipulating the stones to reveal a small recess behind them. Inside was a metal box, sealed with what appeared to be the same sophisticated locking mechanism they had found on the bunker entrance. When the box was carefully brought to the surface, Dr. Hoffman examined it with growing excitement. This is definitely Thule Society craftsmanship, he confirmed. The symbols match their security protocols exactly. The lock, however, presented an immediate challenge. It required a specific key and authentication sequence that none of them possessed. My grandfather's pocket watch, Thomas suddenly remembered. He never went anywhere without it, and he specifically mentioned in his stories that time itself holds the key to darkness. I always thought it was just a metaphor. The watch, a family heirloom, was stored in Thomas's bedroom. A team member was dispatched to retrieve it, while the scientific team continued monitoring the increasingly unstable energy readings from the bunker. According to their calculations, they now had less than 30 minutes before catastrophic containment failure. When the watch arrived, Thomas examined it with new perspective. The antique timepiece had always seemed ordinary, except for unusual engravings on the back that he had assumed were merely decorative. Now he recognized them as matching symbols found in the Thule documentation. The watch itself might be the key, Dr. Hoffman suggested, comparing the distinctive winding stem to the lock mechanism on the metal box. Thomas carefully inserted the watch stem into the lock, and to everyone's amazement, it fit perfectly. Following an instinct he couldn't fully explain, he aligned the watch hands to 11:29, the time his grandfather had always said was when the world changed forever. With a distinct click, The lock disengaged. Inside the box lay a small device unlike anything Thomas had seen before, a crystalline object embedded in what appeared to be a copper and gold housing, with intricate circuitry that seemed impossibly advanced for something created in the 1940s. "It's a resonance key," Dr. Chen breathed, examining the device with amazement. "These crystals appear to be piezoelectric, but with molecular alignment patterns I've never seen before. This could potentially disrupt the temporal field without triggering catastrophic collapse." As they rushed the device back to the command center, the energy readings from the bunker continued to deteriorate. The scientific team worked frantically to interface the resonance key with their monitoring equipment, attempting to understand its operational parameters before time ran out. "Based on these readings, I believe the key generates a counter-frequency that could neutralize the temporal field," Chen explained, "but we need to position it directly adjacent to Die Glock for maximum effectiveness." This presented an immediate challenge. The bunker's increasing instability made direct access potentially suicidal, yet without direct application of the resonance key, catastrophic containment failure seemed inevitable. "I'll take it down," Thomas volunteered, surprising himself with the decisiveness of his statement. "That's not happening," Reynolds countered. "Immediately. We have specialized personnel for high-risk operations, none of whom have my family connection to this situation," Thomas argued. "My grandfather left this key for exactly this scenario. There might be recognition factors or authentication requirements we don't understand. It has to be me." Blackwood studied him carefully before nodding. "Prepare Mr. Caldwell with whatever protective equipment we have available, full remote monitoring and communication systems, and prepare emergency extraction protocols." 20 minutes later, Thomas descended into the bunker wearing a specialized protective suit designed to shield against both conventional radiation and the unknown properties of temporal energy fields. The facility's main chamber, which had been a model of German efficiency when first discovered, now pulsed with unstable energy that distorted light and created visual anomalies throughout the space. Die Glock itself, the bell, sat at the chamber's center, a metallic device approximately 8 feet tall, with counter-rotating components now spinning at speeds that rendered them nearly invisible. The air around it appeared to warp and ripple, as if reality itself was becoming unstable in its presence. "Energy levels continuing to build," came Dr. Chen's voice through Thomas's communication system. "You have approximately 12 minutes before projected containment failure. The application point should be at the base of the central column, where the primary power coupling connects." Thomas moved carefully toward the device, each step requiring conscious effort as the temporal distortion created resistance that felt like moving through invisible currents. The resonance key in his protected hands began to respond to proximity to Die Glock, the crystalline components glowing with increasing intensity as he approached. At the base of the bell, Thomas identified the connection point Chen had described, a sophisticated interface where power conduits fed into the primary mechanism. As he prepared to place the resonance key, something unexpected happened. The device began to project what appeared to be holographic images around the chamber. Scenes flashed across the walls, historical moments Thomas recognized interspersed with visions of events he didn't. World War II battlefields dissolving into futuristic landscapes, Nazi scientists transforming into figures wearing advanced technological gear, unlike anything in current existence. It was as if Die Glocke was displaying the very timeline connections it had been designed to establish. "Thomas, we're detecting massive energy fluctuations." Chen's voice came urgently through the communication system. "Whatever's happening is accelerating the process. You need to apply the key immediately." As Thomas reached toward the connection point, a final holographic image appeared directly before him, a clear representation of his grandfather in military uniform, standing alongside several German scientists in what appeared to be this very chamber. The implication was unmistakable. His grandfather hadn't merely been assigned to monitor the facility, he had been directly involved in its creation. In that moment of revelation, Thomas understood the true nature of his family's connection to the Thule technology. They hadn't been unwitting guardians, but knowing custodians, trusted to protect the technology until its predetermined activation time. His grandfather's stories hadn't been bedtime fictions, but carefully encoded instructions, preparing Thomas for this exact moment. With this understanding, Thomas placed the resonance key against the connection point. The crystalline device immediately bonded to the surface as if magnetically attracted, its glow intensifying to painful brightness as it interfaced with Diglock's systems. "It's working," Chen reported, her voice reflecting surprised relief. "The energy signature is stabilizing. The temporal field is collapsing in a controlled manner rather than catastrophic failure." The bell's rotation began to slow, the visual distortions throughout the chamber gradually diminishing as the resonance key systematically neutralized the dangerous harmonics that had threatened to tear a hole in reality itself. Thomas stepped back, watching as the technology that had remained hidden beneath his farm for generations finally powered down. In the sudden silence that followed, Thomas stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by the remnants of an extraordinary technological achievement that had nearly caused disaster. The holographic images had vanished, but the questions they raised remained about his family's true history, about the lines between guardian and collaborator, and about how many other secrets remained buried beneath the surface of accepted reality. 3 months later, Thomas sat on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the autumn sun set over fields that had returned to their peaceful appearance. The massive government operation had eventually withdrawn, leaving behind sophisticated monitoring equipment disguised as ordinary agricultural infrastructure, and a lifetime non-disclosure agreement that Thomas had signed with full understanding of its implications. The bunker had been permanently sealed with advanced materials designed to contain any residual energy signatures, while the bell itself had been removed to a specialized facility for continued study under carefully controlled conditions. The official cover story attributed the massive government presence to a historical preservation project related to early Cold War infrastructure. Technically true, while concealing the extraordinary reality. Werner had returned to his dairy farm after extensive debriefing, their neighborly relationship forever altered by the revealed truth of their families' intertwined histories. They spoke little of what had happened, both understanding that some knowledge was safer left undisturbed, yet both remaining vigilant for any signs that the technology might not be as neutralized as everyone believed. The various factions that had converged on Thomas's farm, seeking to claim the Thule technology, had been dealt with through a combination of diplomatic channels, intelligence operations, and in some cases, carefully managed misinformation. The world continued turning, blissfully unaware of how close it had come to a temporal catastrophe that might have fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself. Director Blackwood had visited once, several weeks after the main operation. Concluded, the conversation had been brief but significant. "Your grandfather made a choice," Blackwood had told him, sitting in the same kitchen where Thomas had first encountered government agents at dawn. After seeing what the Thule technology was capable of, he decided it was too dangerous to destroy, but too dangerous to use. So he adapted their plan, maintained the appearance of compliance while secretly ensuring the technology could be neutralized if ever activated prematurely. He was a double agent, Thomas had concluded, finally understanding the complex legacy he had inherited, of the most important kind. Blackwood confirmed. The kind nobody ever knows about, because if they succeed, nothing happens. The disaster that never occurs. The history that continues uninterrupted. Now, as dusk settled over his farm, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary truth that had lain buried beneath his fields for generations. Not just a Nazi bunker, but a moral complexity that defied simple categorization. His grandfather, neither hero nor villain, but something more nuanced, had chosen to guard a dangerous technology rather than risk its destruction or misuse by others. In the distance, Thomas could see lights coming on at the Werner farm as night approached. Two families, bound by a secret history spanning continents and generations, continuing their quiet vigilance in rural Pennsylvania, maintaining their own private watch over buried truths. The world was safer not knowing. Thomas fingered his grandfather's pocket watch, now carrying a significance beyond family heirloom. Time itself holds the key to darkness, his grandfather had said. Now Thomas understood. Sometimes the most important duty wasn't fighting dramatic battles, but simply ensuring that time itself continued flowing as it should, undisturbed by those who would bend its course to serve their own ambitions. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets remained buried beneath the surface of ordinary places, forgotten technologies, hidden histories, and quiet guardians maintaining their generational vigils far from public awareness. The world had nearly witnessed a technological apocalypse originating from his peaceful farm, yet had continued in blissful ignorance because of actions few would ever know about or understand. Perhaps that was the greatest legacy his grandfather had left him, the understanding that history's most important moments sometimes weren't the ones recorded in books, but the disasters that never happened because someone made a difficult choice and kept a necessary secret. A legacy Thomas now continued as he watched over his family farm, where a farmer's plow had once struck metal and nearly changed the world.